she thought it was just another job, a way to keep the ghosts of her past at bay, to put food on her own table, and maybe find a sliver of peace in a life that had offered her so little. Her name was Mai Lin, and when she answered the call to cook for a group of cowboys on a remote ranch, she never imagined the path it would lead her down. To her, it sounded simple enough. Rise before the sun painted the sky, prepare hearty meals for hard-working men, and ensure they had something warm in their stomachs before they faced the vast, unforgiving land. It was hard work, she knew, but she was no stranger to hardship. She had faced far worse, endured much more. The town she left behind had been a cage of quiet scorn and whispered insults. After her father's death, a man who had poured his life savings from the railroad into a small, struggling noodle house, she was left alone to face the pointed glares and cold shoulders of people who saw her as nothing more than an unwelcome foreigner. Work was scarce for a young Chinese woman, and every dollar she earned was stretched thin. She had known the deep, gnawing hunger that settles in your bones and makes your thoughts heavy. Her hands, once delicate, had grown rough from whatever labor she could find, washing clothes for families who barely looked her in the eye, mending fabrics for merchants who paid her half what they'd pay anyone else, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. Yet, she carried on, because stopping was never an option. When she heard about the cooking job on the Hayes Ranch, it felt like both a lifeline and a risk. Ranch life was not for the faint of heart, and feeding a crew of American cowboys was a world away from the cooking she knew. But she had grit, a quiet resilience forged in the fires of loss and necessity. She had been raised to rise early, to put in the effort even when her body ached for rest. Cooking was something she understood, a language of care and sustenance that reminded her of the few good memories she clung to, the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the scent of ginger and scallions, the comfort of a shared meal. So when the offer came, she did not hesitate. She packed the few belongings she owned, a worn dress, her mother's jade pendant, and a set of chopsticks she couldn't bear to leave behind, and left the town that had offered her little more than judgment. The journey to the ranch was long, a dusty trail that wound through endless fields and broken fences. She arrived at dawn, the sky still streaked with shades of gray and pale blue. The ranch was immense, a sprawling kingdom of rolling land that stretched as far as her eyes could see. Horses snorted from a distant corral, their breath rising like smoke in the morning chill. The main house stood sturdy, its wooden frame worn but strong, with a smaller building nearby that she quickly learned was the bunkhouse. That was where the cowboys lived, men who worked from first light until the stars blanketed the sky. She stepped into the kitchen and for a fleeting moment, doubt struck her like a physical blow. The stove was a massive, old iron beast, blackened with years of use. Pots and pans hung from hooks, dented and scarred, but still serviceable. The shelves held giant sacks of flour, beans, and potatoes, along with slabs of dried meat. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. Tying her apron, she got to work. The first morning, she built the fire high, the crackle of wood echoing through the stillness of the house. She kneaded a heavy dough until her arms ached, her technique different from the light touch needed for steamed buns, but she adapted. She stirred pots of beans until steam clouded her face and fried thick slices of bacon until the smell filled every corner of the house. By the time the cowboys filed in, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, the table was set with stacks of lopsided biscuits, beans, fried eggs, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They ate in silence at first, casting quick, measuring glances her way. She was the newcomer, the outsider, a small, quiet woman in a world of loud, weathered men. She felt their curiosity and their suspicion. Some nodded in grudging approval of the food, while others simply kept their eyes on their plates. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to win them over with words. Her work would have to speak for her. By the end of the meal, every plate was clean, every cup drained. The men rose, some tipping their hats in quiet thanks before heading out to the day's grueling labor. Day after day, the pattern repeated. She rose before dawn, worked until her back ached, and fed the men with whatever the ranch stores allowed. Sometimes it was hearty meals of beef and potatoes. Other times it was simple stews, stretched thin but flavored with a care they weren't used to. Slowly, she learned to make their food, the heavy biscuits, the thick gravies, but she couldn't help but add her own touches. A bit of wild onion foraged from near the creek, a careful balance of salt and pepper, a way of searing the meat that kept it tender. The cowboys began to talk more around her, their voices filling the large dining room with laughter and stories of cattle drives, wild nights in town, and close calls with nature. She didn't join in much, her English still careful and deliberate, but she listened. Their stories painted pictures of a life rougher and freer than anything she had ever known. Still, her mind often returned to her own reasons for being there. She hadn't just taken the job for survival. She needed to prove to herself that she was more than the sum of the hardships she had endured, that she could build something honest with her own 2 hands. Each loaf of bread, each pot of stew, each cup of coffee became more than food. It became proof of her resilience. Yet, even as she settled into her role, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. She carried the weight of her past with her, the memories of people who had cast her aside, who had judged her by the shape of her eyes and the language of her ancestors. It was hard to believe this place would be different. But slowly, small signs began to appear. A cowboy named Jake, who had a gruff exterior, started leaving an extra portion of flour by the kitchen door whenever he returned from the supply run. Another, a younger man named Ben, began tipping his hat each morning with a shy smile. One afternoon, she found the broken step on the kitchen porch had been fixed, the new wood smooth and sturdy beneath her feet. They were small gestures, but they meant the world. They told her she was not invisible here. Through it all, she noticed one man who stood apart from the others. He wasn't louder, nor did he try to draw attention to himself. He worked with the crew, ate at the same table, and wore the same dust-stained clothes, but there was a stillness in him, a steadiness that made him different. He never rushed his words, never wasted them. He watched more than he spoke, and though his eyes rarely lingered on her, she felt the weight of his presence. To her, he was just another cowboy, another man shaped by the harshness of the land. His name, she learned, was Arthur. He never teased her, but he also never offered empty pleasantries. He simply treated her with a quiet, unassuming respect. She never guessed that behind his quiet nature lay a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about the ranch and her place in it. For now, she focused on her work, on the rhythm of kneading and stirring, unaware that each meal she served, each day she endured, was drawing her closer to a truth hidden in plain sight. The days on the ranch fell into a steady, comforting rhythm, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. My Lynn was up before the first rooster crowed, the kitchen already warm with fire by the time the cowboys stumbled in, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Her hands worked with a practiced speed, shaping dough, slicing onions, stirring pots until steam filled the air. She found a strange solace in the routine. It gave her purpose, a sense of control that had been absent from her life for so long. It kept her from dwelling on the past. Every meal she placed on the table was another way of proving to herself, most of all, that she could stand on her own 2 feet. The cowboys grew accustomed to her presence. At first, they had been cautious, their curiosity tinged with the prejudice common in those times. But hunger softened judgment, and the undeniable quality of her cooking carried more weight than any introduction. Soon they came to rely on her the way they relied on their saddles and spurs. When the work was long and the nights turned cold, her food gave them strength and a rare piece of comfort. They started calling her Mai, a simple acknowledgement that felt more genuine than any formal title. They teased her sometimes, tossing light-hearted jokes across the table about her small stature or the strange-smelling herbs she sometimes used, but it was never cruel. She wasn't one of them, but she wasn't an outsider anymore either. She learned their habits. Young Ben always asked for seconds, his appetite seemingly bottomless. An older cowboy named Tom never spoke much, but he always set his empty coffee cup back near the stove, a silent request for more. These small details told her who they were, and in return, she found herself remembered in ways she hadn't expected. A sack of fresh apples left on the counter after a trip to town. A jar of wild honey placed by the stove. Repairs made quietly around the kitchen without her needing to ask. These were little signs of respect, and they slowly chipped away at the wall she had built around her heart. But among all of them, Arthur remained the hardest to read. He sat at the table like the rest, spoke when needed, and laughed occasionally at a joke, but there was something different about him. He was watchful, his presence a steady anchor in the boisterous room. While the younger men were quick to fill silence with chatter, he seemed content to let silence breathe. His hands were strong and sure, his voice calm, his words chosen with care. She couldn't decide whether he carried more weight on his shoulders than the others or simply chose to bear it differently. He never treated her unkindly. If anything, he treated her with the same quiet consideration he gave everyone else, without fuss or judgment. But she felt an inexplicable pull toward his quiet nature. He would sometimes offer to carry heavy sacks of flour into the kitchen, his movements efficient and without complaint. He would nod his thanks after meals, not dramatically, but with a direct look that made her feel seen. And when the work outside grew tense, when tempers flared among the men over a lost calf or a broken tool, his was the voice that cut through the noise, calm and steady enough to settle the storm. To her, he seemed like a cowboy who had simply been shaped by the land into a man of substance. She had no reason to think otherwise. His boots were as worn as the rest, his shirt patched at the elbow, his hands calloused from hard labor. If there was a secret about him, it was buried deep, and he showed no sign of revealing it. As the weeks turned into months, she learned just how harsh ranch life could be. A sudden storm rolled across the plains without warning, its violent winds tearing at fences and scattering the cattle. Days of hard rain followed, leaving mud so thick it swallowed boots whole. The sun, when it finally returned, burned with a relentless intensity that blistered the skin. The cowboys worked through it all, their bodies pushed to exhaustion, and she worked beside them in her own way, feeding them, keeping them steady with hot meals waiting no matter how rough the day had been. It was during one of these storms that she saw Arthur in a different light. The winds had been howling all day, rattling the windows of the kitchen while she struggled to keep the fire from being smothered by downdrafts. The cowboys came in drenched and exhausted, mud dripping from their clothes, their faces lined with fatigue. She set food before them, and they ate in a heavy silence, the storm outside louder than their voices. But when she looked up, she caught his eyes for just a moment before he looked away. There was something in them she couldn't name, something resolute, steady, but also protective, as though he carried not just his own weight, but the weight of the entire ranch. That night, as the wind screamed through the trees, she lay awake on her narrow cot, her mind circling back to that glance. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was only tired, her imagination running wild. Still, the thought lingered. Who was he, really? Why did he seem so different from the rest? The days after the storm tested everyone. Fences had to be repaired, cattle rounded up, and supplies were stretched thin. She cooked with whatever she had left, turning scraps and staples into meals that warmed the men enough to keep them going. The cowboys grumbled about the endless work, but not him. He simply did what needed to be done, his presence a constant, reassuring force. No complaint, no boasting. She watched him more closely then, drawn not by his words, but by the quiet strength in how he carried himself. One evening, when the work was finally done and the men sat around the table, one of the younger hands teased her about the bread being a little burnt on the bottom. Laughter filled the room, but Arthur silenced it with a single glance. It wasn't harsh or unkind, but it was firm enough to remind them of their manners. The teasing ended abruptly, and she felt a warmth stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, someone had stood for her, even in the smallest way. She thought about it long after the table had been cleared, as she washed dishes by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. She thought about how easy it was for men to laugh at her, how quickly people had dismissed her in the past. Yet here, in this rough and unforgiving place, a man who said little had spoken on her behalf without uttering a single word. She didn't know his secret. She didn't know why he seemed different. To her, he was just another cowboy in worn boots and a dust-stained shirt. But something about him unsettled her heart in ways she couldn't yet explain. And soon enough, she would learn the truth, that he wasn't just a man among them, but the one who owned everything they stood on. The weeks stretched into months, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost unshakable. Morning came early, as always, with the sound of boots on wooden floors and the clatter of pans in the kitchen. The men ate fast, talking in low voices before scattering into the fields to work. Lin watched them ride out from the porch sometimes, horses kicking up dust against the rising sun, and wondered if this vast, empty land could ever feel like a home to her. She had grown stronger in those months. The fear she carried when she first arrived had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. Her hands were sure as she cooked, her voice firmer when she gave directions to the younger cowboys who came to help her haul water or split wood. She didn't feel invisible anymore. There were eyes that noticed her now, not just as the woman who filled their plates, but as someone who belonged to the life they were building out here. Among all of them, though, her thoughts returned most often to Arthur. He still didn't speak much, yet somehow his silence communicated more than the others' words. He carried himself differently, with a steady, calm authority that was undeniable. When tempers flared over cattle lost in a storm, he was the one who calmed the others with a simple word or a grounding look. When fences broke or supplies ran thin, he didn't complain. He just worked, as though nothing was too heavy for him to bear. She began to notice the small details of his character. He always made sure his horse was cared for, brushed, fed, and watered before he sat down to eat his own meal. He never left the table until everyone else had their fill. And sometimes, late at night, she'd glance out her small cabin window and see him walking the edge of the property, a solitary figure moving through the darkness as if making sure nothing threatened the place they all depended on. He seemed more like a guardian than just a ranch hand. One evening, after a long day of work, she found herself outside by the well, drawing water for the morning. The sky was painted in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon. She didn't hear him approach at first, his steps quiet on the packed earth, but then he was there, his hand reaching out to steady the heavy bucket before it slipped from her grasp. She looked up in surprise, words caught in her throat. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened in the fading light. "Careful," he said simply, and then he took the bucket from her and carried it inside for her, its weight seeming like nothing to him. It was a small thing, yet it lingered with her long after. No one had looked out for her in such a way for years, not since before life had hardened around her. She tried to brush it off, to tell herself she was reading too much into a simple act of courtesy. But when she lay awake that night, listening to the lonely sound of the wind outside, she couldn't shake the memory of his hand steadying hers, the brief, solid warmth of his touch. The truth about him was still hidden, and she had no real reason to suspect it. He blended in too well, wore the same worn clothes, and lived the same rough life as the others. To her, he was another cowboy among many, one who just happened to carry himself with a quiet strength that drew her in. She didn't know yet that the land he worked, the cattle he rode out to protect, the very house she cooked in, all of it was his. The storm had left its mark on the ranch. Fences were splintered, the barn roof leaked in a dozen places, and the men moved more slowly than before, their bodies aching from days without proper rest. Lin kept the kitchen fire burning brighter than usual, knowing the warmth was as important as the food itself. Each pot of stew, each fresh loaf of bread was more than a meal, it was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, that strength came back one step at a time. She worked harder, too, though her own body protested. Her hands were red and raw from scrubbing, her back sore from lifting heavy cast iron pots. But when she saw the cowboys dragging themselves to the table, their shoulders slumped with exhaustion, she found the energy to keep going. They had carried the ranch through the storm. The least she could do was make sure they had something hot and fortifying waiting for them. It was in these weary days of rebuilding that she noticed Arthur more than ever. He was there at sunrise, already moving before the others, checking fences, counting cattle, repairing what the storm had broken. He asked for nothing, took no credit, but it was clear to her that he carried more than his share of the work. She saw it in the way the younger men looked to him, waiting for direction without even realizing they were doing it. She saw it in the way no one questioned his judgment. He wasn't just another hand. He was the one they followed, even if they didn't say it aloud. One afternoon, she stepped outside after the midday dishes were washed, the sound of rhythmic hammering echoing from the far end of the corral. He was there, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, driving nails into a broken rail with powerful, efficient strokes. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over, picked up a handful of nails that had spilled onto the ground, and held them out to him. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his hammer stilled, as though weighing the silent offer. Then he gave a short nod, his calloused hand brushing against hers as he took them. That small, accidental touch sent a shiver through her, though she told herself it was only the chill of the afternoon wind. They worked in a comfortable silence for a while. She handed him nails as he needed them and held a long board steady as he secured it in place. Her arms ached from the unfamiliar strain, but she refused to show it. When the section of fence was finally upright and sturdy again, he stood back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. "Sturdy," he said simply. She almost smiled at the way he spoke, his words short, certain, as if a single word could hold the weight of an entire sentence. That night, when the men gathered at the table, she noticed how the others leaned into his presence. He didn't demand it, but the respect was there all the same, unspoken but clear. She began to wonder more deeply who he really was. No ordinary cowboy carried himself with such an innate authority, with a steadiness that seemed rooted in the very land itself. The truth began to press at the edges of her mind, though she still couldn't see it fully. She only knew that the ranch felt different when he was near, safer, somehow more certain. She found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, catching herself glancing toward him more often than she meant to. And though she told herself it was nothing, she couldn't deny that something about him pulled at her, steady and quiet, like the rhythm of the earth. One evening, a small group of riders came through, men from a neighboring ranch stopping by for supplies. They stayed long enough to share a meal, and the conversation was lively, filled with talk of cattle prices and the damage recent storms had done across the county. My Lynn kept to her work, serving food and listening from the edges of the room. But then she heard one of the visitors laugh and say, "It's strange how the owner of this place keeps himself so hidden. You'd think a man with this much land, a man like Mr. Hayes, would be easier to spot." The word struck her like a stone. She glanced instinctively toward Arthur, expecting him to look up, to laugh along, to act as puzzled as the others. But he didn't. He simply kept eating, his face calm, his eyes lowered to his plate as if he hadn't heard a thing. And in that heavy silence, she felt the truth click into place with a terrifying certainty. Her hands trembled as she carried a tray of bread back to the kitchen. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to assume too much. But all the signs she had ignored now stood out with glaring clarity, the way the men deferred to him, the way he worked harder than anyone yet never asked for praise, the way he walked the land at night as though it belonged to him, because it did. She struggled to keep her breath steady, to move as though nothing had changed. But inside, her thoughts spun in a dizzying vortex. She had been cooking for him all along, not just another cowboy, but the man who owned the ranch, the land, perhaps even the lives of those who worked here. And he had chosen not to tell her. That night, after the visitors had ridden off and the men had drifted to their bunks, she found herself alone in the kitchen, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Her heart pounded with questions she couldn't quiet. Why had he hidden it? Why live among them as if he were no different? And what did it mean for her, the woman who had come here with nothing but the desperate hope of survival? She thought of every meal she had served him, every quiet glance exchanged across the table, every small kindness he had shown. All of it carried a new, staggering weight now. He hadn't just been another ranch hand grateful for her food. He had been the one watching, measuring, perhaps testing her without her ever knowing. She pressed her hands against the cool wooden table, steadying herself. The fire flickered low, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Her world had shifted without warning, and nothing felt simple anymore. She had stepped onto this ranch believing she was just the cook, but now she knew her place in this story was far more tangled than she had ever imagined. The next morning felt different, though the ranch carried on as usual. The men rose at dawn, their boots thudding against the floor, their voices low and tired. My Lynn moved through the kitchen with a practiced ease that belied the turmoil in her heart, frying bacon, pouring coffee, placing biscuits in the oven. But her thoughts weren't on the food. They circled back to him, the man she had mistaken for a simple cowboy. Now, every glance in his direction carried weight. Every word he spoke seemed layered with hidden meaning. He entered the dining room quietly, as he always did, his shoulders broad, his boots carrying the fine dust of the early morning. He didn't command the room with noise or a grand presence, but the atmosphere still shifted when he sat at the table. The others glanced his way before speaking, as though his silence gave them permission. She had noticed it before, but now she understood why. He wasn't simply respected, he was the one who held everything together, because the land, the work, the entire operation belonged to him. As she placed a plate in front of him, her hand trembled slightly. He didn't look up, only murmured a soft, "Thank you," but she felt the weight of his attention more than ever. She wondered if he knew she had pieced the truth together. She wondered if he was waiting for her to say something, but she remained silent. Not yet. The day passed in a slow-motion haze. She kept busy with chores, cleaning, preparing for the evening meal, mending a tear in one of the Cowboys' shirts. Yet her mind kept drifting. She thought of the storm and the way he had led without boasting. She thought of the night she had seen him walking the edge of the ranch, a silent sentinel watching over them all. And she thought of how he had chosen to sit at the table like the rest, to eat the same food, to share the same hardships, never once revealing the power he held. It confused her, unsettled her, but it also sparked a deep curiosity. Why would a man with such power choose to hide it? That evening, when the men had gone to their bunks and the fire in the main house burned low, she found herself alone with him. He was at the long wooden table, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes. The rhythmic scrape of steel against stone was the only sound in the quiet room. She hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing, but then she stepped forward, her resolve hardening. "You're not just one of them," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his hand stilling. His eyes met hers across the room, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The knife rested in his hand, his expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Finally, he set it down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and direct. "You figured it out." Her breath caught. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people act different when they know," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was a profound weight behind his words. "I wanted to see who people were, not who they thought they needed to be for the owner." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the worn fabric of her apron. "And what did you see?" "In me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his eyes searching her face as though measuring every line, every truth she carried. "I saw someone who doesn't quit," he said at last, his voice low and serious. "Someone who works harder than anyone gives her credit for. Someone who belongs here more than she realizes." The word belongs struck her deeper than she expected. For years, she had been told in countless ways that she didn't belong, that she had no worth beyond what others decided. And here was a man, the one man who could claim absolute authority over her, telling her the opposite. It left her unsteady, unsure of what to say. "You watched me without saying a word," she whispered. "Do you know what that feels like? To think you're just a hired hand, only to find out you were being tested all along." His brow furrowed slightly. "It wasn't a test." "Not for you." "It was for me." She blinked. "For you?" He nodded slowly. "I needed to know if I could trust the people around me. Men can lie when they want something from the boss. But when they think you're just another hand, they show their true selves. That's the only way I know who really belongs on my land." She let the words sink in. It explained so much, yet still left 100 questions lingering in the air. Why her? Why had he allowed her to stay when he could have dismissed her so easily? She looked down, her chest tight with a confusing mix of indignation and a strange, unfamiliar sense of validation. Then she looked back at him. "And do I belong here?" His eyes softened just enough to break through the hard set of his face. "You've proved that a dozen times over, my Lynn." The fire crackled, filling the silence that stretched between them. She felt her heart beat faster, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else entirely. For the first time, she didn't see him as just the quiet cowboy or even the powerful owner of the land. She saw him as a man who had chosen to carry the weight of others, even when it meant hiding who he really was. Her mind spun with possibilities. What did this mean for her and her daughters, for the life she was trying so desperately to rebuild? Could this ranch be more than just a job, more than just a place to survive? She didn't have the answers. Not yet. But she knew the truth had changed everything. The next morning, when the men filed into the kitchen for breakfast, she caught his eye across the table. He gave the same quiet nod he always did, but this time it carried a new meaning, an unspoken understanding that passed between them. She wasn't just the cook anymore, and he wasn't just another cowboy. Something connected them now, something neither had yet put into words. The days ahead would bring more work, more storms, more whispers from the town that judged what it didn't understand. But as she watched him rise from the table, shoulders squared, gaze steady, she felt a flicker of strength she hadn't known in years. The land was his, yes, but in some way she couldn't yet explain. It felt like it was becoming hers, too.